G'day viewers, so today we're continuing with our foray into Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition, specifically getting into it and helping players that are in the modern generation what they need to do to try and capture some of that feel for the 1st edition. So today we're going to look at a few of the highlights of 1st edition, which is particularly hit points in combat and a few of the weapons charts and some of those sorts of things to help make understanding, and why we ended up with the THACO system that we all remember fondly, and then which has turned into the sort of combat system that we've got today in 5th edition, with the armor class being the overall armor. So before we get too far into combat, we need to think about what hit points are and what they represent. It's not just about the single number of points, and that's a meter of how much damage and that you've taken before your character falls unconscious, which sort of is, but the point of the hit points is that they're also to represent the luck and the skill that increases. So a sword slash that would run through a 1st level fighter might be just a nick on the cheek for a 10th level fighter because of the sheer skill. Now, if you remember that the idea of combat being almost a full minute or long enough time for thrusts and parries and the swirling melee as it's called, and in that time you've got a number of different things that happen within that combat. So what the weapon damage represents is obviously the attacks made, but they also reflect everything else. And that's where the stylized fantasy combat comes into play. So let's just have a quick look at how combat works in 1st edition D&D. To start with, let's just keep it simple. So we're looking at fighters being their primary role fighting and have the best chart for hitting. Now you'll see at the top here the level of the character and then a string of numbers versus their the actual armor class. The worst that an armor class can get is is 10, and the best that it can be is -10. And everything in between is there. So you can sort of understand how the concept of to hit armor class 0, or as we call it, THACO, for 1st level fighters is 20, and then if you wanted to hit an armor class 3, you just minus 3 from that dice roll. So fighters progress, or have the option of progressing, at 1 point every level. Or you can run it like this, where it's at 3rd level, it increases by 2. If we have a look at the next best chart, they also have to hit armor class 0 of 20, and so on. So at 1st to 3rd level, monks, druids and clerics are on par with fighters. Moving over to magic users, who are the worst, from levels 1 to 5, you'll notice that to hit armor class 0, it's still 20, but to hit armor class 1 is also 20. And this is one of those areas of 1st edition D&D where it stands apart. We'll go through that in a few moments. And this is the thief, where you'll see also thieves and assassins. They have the same as magic users for levels 1 to 4. They also progress faster, so they can improve to some degree, but not as much as the others. Now, in terms of how the monsters work, it goes by the hit dice. So an orc with 1 hit dice hits armor class 0 at 19, sort of highlighting their rougher lifestyle. They get slightly improved. They usually have chance of hitting, but they usually have less hit points on average. But a few orcs are a good match against a well-balanced party. They also have the 1/1 goblins and such, and then less. So the 1/1 is more in line with a fighter, first level fighter, and then you've got the to hit armor class 1 at 20. So the string of 20s, you've got the first 20 that represents what's called the dirty 20, where any dice roll plus all modifiers makes a 20 or higher. So if you've got a +3 to hit, then you need to roll 17 or better. The second, third, fourth, fifth, and I think sixth 20, they're all natural 20s required. So then after that it's natural 20s and plus modifiers. So someone with an armor class of, so a character with a -2 armor class can only be hit by a natural 20. Hit by an orc on a natural 20. So you can see how armor class does affect certain things, but to get to the negatives you're looking at other protections and dexterity bonuses and various other modifiers. So it's not just a matter of wearing full plate armor, which is armor class and shield. Full plate armor and shield is armor class 2. There are other modifiers involved. So that's the nuts and bolts of it. But what does it actually mean? Combine that with the hit points. You might have a fighter of 20 or 30 hit points versus 2 or 3 orcs who have 4 or 5 hit points each. It's still the randomization of combat. It's no guarantee with this game that every combat goes in the favour of the highest level character. There are always ways of getting modifiers and bonuses in your favour. So once we've rolled our 20-sided dice with a d20 and we've hit our number or better, then we move on to another chart. But before we get to the weapons, like the weapon damage, I just want to go over the second most complicated chart that's in the player's handbook. So the to hit armor type chart for melee and for missile. So this is where the different weapons have their modifiers against the armor. We've gone through this in various other videos and there are many different areas where this has come up, so I won't linger on it too much, only just say that you've got some weapons that are better against heavily armored people and weapons that are better against less armored people. And then they come into the modifiers. So on the top of the roll of the d20, that against leather armor, so the orc wearing leather armor, the fighter rolls the d20, modifies it for other hit bonuses, and then goes down the weapon chart, or has that listed on the character sheet with the modifier, and then that's also there. Now the armor types for against monsters doesn't always reflect an armor as such. Zombies could be easily 8 or 10. Skeletons could be 5. Dragons will always be 2, regardless of their actual armor class. So the red dragon, which has a -1 or -2 armor class, would have a base armor class of 2. And another dragon that might have an armor class of 5 would also have a base armor class of 2. Just reflecting the difference between being bulky and cumbersome and slower and so on. And same too with goblins and orcs. They pretty much have a set armor class, but you might give them the opportunity to have other armor types to make up the difference. Cobbled together bits of chainmail could have a base armor class of 5, even though their normal armor class is 6, or they could have leather armor, but their normal armor class is 6. As a DM, and as you figure it out as you choose to. If you're going to use this chart, then there's some extra work that needs to be modified for the DM. And the same too as when you've got natural weapons. Are they daggers? Are they short swords? There's the lion attacking you as a dagger with its jaws, but as a short sword with its claws, and so on. Manticore spikes as per arrow or dart, and so on. Every DM is going to do it differently, and some DMs even disregard this entire chart. If you wish, disregard this entire chart. Doesn't matter. So then once we've got our hit and our modifiers, we have our damage. Every weapon has a damage of versus small versus medium, and damage of size large. This is to sort of reflect one of two things. Some weapons are built to go after bigger things. Let's cut down to the longsword, which has a D8 and a D12. So the blade attacking a normal human is D8, sort of changing the combat style for the smaller and medium-sized creatures versus the larger creatures and what it can do. You might need a bigger, you can do a larger wind-up and so on. So a two-handed sword is a classic example. It's such a large and cumbersome weapon to use that it's easier for a smaller creature to avoid, and that's part of the whole hit points theory, versus a larger creature which can't get out of the way of a 6-foot blade. They're not as agile. This is what it's designed for. You also have to be over a certain weight to be able to wield this sort of weapon. Anyway, not everyone can pick up a two-handed sword. Short swords, and so on. So this represents the weight in gold pieces. Encumbrance is something to be dealt with later. So once we've hit, we roll the damage, and then the opponent gets a chance to do their action, which is roll to hit and roll some damage. And this is all happening in the same round, the same melee round. And that's part of the whole concept of the inverted commas swirling melee. And if we see some of our more classic movies, and if we read how things work in the books, each weapon isn't exactly just like hit, strike, damage. It's everything involving that weapon, which could be knocking something down, pushing them against the wall, an occasional punch or a hit. And this is where the DM needs to come in and really make combat, like in first edition, that much more the swirling melee. It's less I hit, I strike, I do damage, than it is this is how the combat works. And in this round, you move to the left, thrust and parry, you push him to the side and you smack the opponent across the face, and so on. So that's that first ed feel that you hear about so often. Okay, so we've just dealt a little bit with combat and how combat works. We've gone through how hit points sort of feel. let's get on to some adventuring. So before we get too far into adventuring, I just wanted to cover something just quickly. So if you look through the front of the DM's guide, you've got ages, and this is the age of the character as they start their adventuring career. Humans obviously have their own ages, 18 plus D4, 15 plus D4, and so on with the non-humans. Multi-class characters have their own way of doing things, so they just take the maximum of the highest one. But here's an example of what we were talking about before, where the elf has infinity with magic. At first level, an elf can have a maximum, it'd be a maximum age of 180. So an elf of 180 just puts them in that mature level. By comparison, a non-player character elf that's going to be a cleric starts at 500. So they have that natural affinity with magic, which puts them clearly here in that top end. But why I'm showing you this in terms of adventuring is that obviously as the character gets older, certain effects happen, and there are certain reasons as to why the character may age prematurely. But there's also this chart here. In first edition AD&D, there was less rules on skills and sets of skills, ranks of skills, etc., versus what the player brought to the table. So a character might say, right, I was a forester beforehand, or with working the background they were a miner, or working with the background they were a sailor, and so on. And this is where some of the skills come through in terms of, can I do this, yes or no? And that's pretty much how adventuring worked back in first edition. The DM would just take into consideration various elements. If you were a ranger and you wanted to set up a camp, yep, you can do it. And so on. And a ranger may have a background, if they have a background, of animal husbandry, hunters, fishers, foresters, and so on. So when you think that these are the skills that the character had beforehand, then have a look at the ages that they're at when they start. And then over here. So a human, 14 to 20, young adult, 21 to 40, mature. So if you're a thief, you're going to start about 19, minimum. Fighter, 16, and so on. So when you think that the most skills would have occurred between the years of 10 and when they start, that's what you're looking at here. What can they do? What have they had access to? How many years of practice and training? And when it comes down to a character wanting to do something, combination of stats, background, story, it all comes in. But ultimately the DM decides, yes or no. Can I do this? Yes. Can I do that? No. And some of this may be dice rolls, sort of related. This is where we look at what we were talking about previously with the dice being the tools of the DM. Somebody that wants to do something, the DM may, okay, roll a d8. And as close to a number gets them a better result for that particular task. This is the first ed feel. Can I swim? Okay. Maybe. And you'll find that there's a lot more chances of drowning well, you just drown. Hand me your character sheet. Thanks for coming. You just go sit over there and make sure that the drinks on the table are filled while the rest of us keep playing. So that's where the DM needs to really work the magic in that space. Alright, so adventuring is a risky business. There's always something interesting happening. But some of that's a bit too advanced to try and even work out. Nobody does everything the same way. Some people might do something in one format and another one does something else. But that first ed feel is what we're trying to capture, and especially when it comes to, can I do something? Well, you've been around long enough, your character knows how to do things. Yep, okay, you can do it. Boom. And yes or no. Or make a check, and the DM may decide whether the dice higher or lower are important. Keep it different. That seemed to be the Gary Gygax way. Never give a sucker an even break. But on the flip side, everyone's there to have fun. So here we go, onto the final part, which is, of this section anyway, is equipping the character, or establishing the character, the final stage. Background, history, why you're there, what are you doing, being introduced to everybody, and so on. And don't forget the ever important section on hirelings and henchmen, because you may want to hire a couple of guys if you can afford it. Which brings us over to here, the starting money. So the big questions that the DM needs to sort out is, with multi-class characters, how that equates, whether it's in total or whether it's evened out between the two. Same too with the proficiencies that start with how many the characters have. So a fighter cleric, does a fighter cleric have 6? Does a fighter cleric have 3? Or have 4? Take the maximum, average, or add them both. That's pretty much going to be up to the DM to figure out. And same thing with this. Highest, average, or both. Nothing's right or wrong, just has to be worked out. Then you got your standard basic equipment. Lots of weapons, armor, arms. So the character starts with a set of clothing already and doesn't count towards any encumbrance, but if you buy more clothes, then that's where the extra encumbrance comes into play. And you've got to store it somewhere, put it in your backpack. So you might have 2 or 3 sets of clothing if you wish to purchase that, but you already start with a set of clothing. And every time you buy armor, it automatically comes with all the greaves and the helmets and everything else already attached. So you don't have to have any specific additional helmets. It's just that there are some benefits to having, like the great helm, which is like that big Greek great helm. But that's only if the DM wants to go that way. Everyone loves a bit of herbs. So once we've got the important bits and pieces out of the way, because clearly armor, arms, yep, that's it, we're done. Except you really need to work out what you're doing here. The livestock table, okay. But you might want to buy something for carrying. But remember, things like mules and horses, they don't do too well underground. And pretty much it's hard to get them to cooperate. So something for later maybe. Here we come to the important equipment. Backpack. If you don't have enough large sacks, you're not going to be able to fill it with gold, and you're not going to be able to get experience points for the amount of gold you carry out, because you need to carry the gold out if you're going to claim it as experience points. You don't just get 10,000 XP for finding a blob of gold. You have to fill up all your pockets and sacks and backpacks, containers, and carry it out. Then you get the experience points for it. So volume is important, which will equate to weight, and so on. So large sacks, large pouches, small sacks, hooded pouches, and so on. Scroll cases might be useful. Don't walk around with a wooden chest, but it's handy to know how much they are, so that if you do need to go and get some cash, you might need to, when you ransack a place, take some of these extra items and they'll have a value. And the ever important 10-foot pole. So the question that many people wonder is, what is the 10-foot pole for? There was an adventure right at the beginning where you needed to use the pole to tap in front of you to be able to trigger the traps and to push buttons and levers, and gives you the space. Carrying it obviously is an issue, but still. Torches, lanterns. Even if you're underground, infravision only works to a certain point, and then you really need to make sure that you've got your sight all sorted out. That's why you want to have a link buoy that carries your torches with you. Skins for water or wine. So a skin of water might last for a week if you don't know where or when you're going to get your next drink of water. The DM may include certain effects for travelling across the ground if you're not fully provisioned, which is where this comes into it. You just have to say that you have certain rations. So iron rations, as an example, feels like the grains and the meals that are nuts and berries and things. That's why they're more expensive and they weigh less. Standard rations is just food. Dried food still, and some normal food. Wine. These are suggestions for the DM for things that are not always going to be the set price. So you might go into a place and it might be 3 silver for a good meal, or it might be 5 gold for a fine meal. You know, it doesn't matter. Holy symbols. Once the cleric starts to make their own holy symbol, you'll understand why it's 50 gold pieces for a holy symbol, and why it's 25 gold for holy or unholy water, and so on. So this is important. And carrying an encumbrance, it can be useful. Many people just ignore it and say, oh yeah, whatever, we just have a portable hole we throw everything into, or let's just assume that there's no gap. But when you look back at your strength charts, we do some flipping. How do you differentiate? This is the question between 12 strength and 15 strength. Well, it's in what they can carry. They may not get modifiers to bonuses or damage, but they'll definitely get differences here. And this is where some of those other adventuring tools come in, when, even though we've just dealt with it, but if you've got a higher strength, you just have a high strength. And you someone who's arm wrestling, and if you've got a strength 15, you beat strength 14. Or you might roll 2 6-sided dice, and the 15 gets bonuses to that, to who wins, if it's that important. Or they might roll a d8 and the opponent rolls a d4 or something. If the DM's so inclined to make sure that there's always that chance of failure. But generally, the rule is battle for strength. Who's got the highest strength? That person wins. Battle of wits. Who has the higher intelligence? That person wins. Debate. Morality. That plus that, and so on. You figure it out. You see how it works. What's your strength score? What's your wisdom 14? Yeah, you know not to do that. Dexterity. This is where the thief comes into its play. Some of the skills may fall into the thieves' skills, but for the most part, having a good dexterity just means that you're nimble and dexterous. So sorry about that, we just did a bit of a jump back. But what we're trying to get at here is that it's important, if you're going to include this, that you also go the next step. And you might create packs where you go, for 50 gold you have the following items, and that's fine, to make it easier, which is what they ended up with in 5th edition, where you've got your adventurers pack and so on, and it comes with rope, sacks and skins of water and so on. And the more industrious people will want more than one skin for water or wine, because inevitably there's a time when you'll want to blow something up and have a bladder of air, so that way you can float down a river rather than drown. We discussed drowning earlier. These picks and tools have 0 weight, and they're just wires and clips and things that are held and positioned around the thieves' arms and armour. That's why they're so expensive. And so on. Okay, so that's the start of that. We'll get into a little bit of encumbrance in a moment. So encumbrance is something that needs to be dealt with. I'm trying to get this in focus, sorry. There you go. Because there are always times when you want to do something and you've got on top of you and you're carrying a number of items. And how does that affect? And what are we doing here, right? So armor dictates your movement, assumes human size, that's the important part. So armor dictates movement, and from that your movement can be adjusted by your encumbrance. Everyone starts with 500 gold piece encumbrance, and that's not just gold pieces, that's just also bulkiness. Not just the weight of the object, but also, pointy edges. Just takes up lots of space. You try and put you blow up a balloon and put it in a backpack, then try and put something else next to it. Doesn't matter what it weighs, but it definitely takes up volume. So everyone has 500, which is approximately 50 pounds of kit. Now, putting it into consideration that you've got a Roman legionary that would have 45 pound of daily kit that they would carry around with them. So, in that instance, 500 is about right. Makes you unencumbered, and away you go. Then obviously the higher your strength, the more you've got. So you got 15 strength, they can add a few hundred extra. And that could mean a few hundred GP, med sack, that extra tapestry, because we love carrying tapestries, and so on. So it's worth investigating whether it's something to include, and that's entirely the purview of the DM. If the DM has something else, a different system or a different style they want to do, it's entirely up to them. Okay, I think we've got this session down. Thanks for listening.
Disturbed. These dispatches bear the seal of Spain. You won't be as lucky this time as at Panama.